All right, thank you for the songs. We'll be going to Isaiah chapter 46. In our series through the book of Isaiah, this is now message number 57, entitled God Carries His Nation. So we're going to be looking at chapter 46. It has 13 verses. I'll read the first 4 verses as we get started. Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. Your carriages were heavy loaden. They are a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. Hearken unto me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, which are born by me from the belly, which are carried from the womb. And even to your old age I am he. And even to hoar hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear. Even I will carry and will deliver you. So chapter 45 that we looked at last time continued that prophecy of Cyrus. And it's very plain that his path was a path that was ordered by God. He would be the deliverer of Israel in terms of returning them from the exile to Babylon. They would rebuild the city and rebuild the walls, and they would lay the foundation of the temple. And so Cyrus was the really sort of the linchpin in that happening in that time. But in God's order and in God's providence, and these are some of the things that we really wrestle with, we struggle with. We wonder about issues of free will and God's sovereignty and how all these things go together. And we have passages like this that give us a lot of help if we just think about what we see here. Because in God's order, we are told that Cyrus would do this freely. It wasn't by coercion. It wasn't by payment or promise of some reward or some great payoff. He would do these things from his own mind. And that's exactly what was said about the Assyrians much, much earlier in Isaiah. That even though that they were a rod in God's hand, they were an instrument that God would use, but nevertheless, they didn't know anything about that. They were just doing what they wanted to do, but yet it fulfilled God's will. Well, he says the same thing about Cyrus. So in the case of the Assyrians, it was destructive, and in the case of Cyrus, it was constructive. But nevertheless, in both cases, they weren't believers. They weren't those that trusted in Yahweh, but they did what they wanted to do, and by doing what they wanted to do, they actually fulfilled God's will. That is God's order. That is God's providence. That's how he rules over his creation. And so when we wrestle with those things, it's usually more on a philosophical level, because practically in our lives, it's very clear. What's our responsibility? Well, our responsibility is to do what God says to do, what he tells us to do in his word, and to not do what he tells us to not do. So that's our responsibility. And we leave the running of the universe to him. He also, in this chapter, revealed the shame of all idolaters, those that trust in idols. And this is sort of thematic in this section, this opening section of part 2 of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 48. There's a shame for these idolaters, and them being brought to shame is about them being confounded, that what they trusted in, what they put their trust in, what they put their hope in, could not deliver them in the end. And they are brought to shame. He also, in chapter 45, was chiding Israel because Israel was contending with God's plans. And we have that imagery of the clay and the potter that pops up a few times within Scripture, and usually in the context of, can that clay really argue with the potter about the purpose for which it has been made? Uses the imagery of a child that's born, and a very young child in the case, the language that's used, a child arguing against its parents, complaining against its parents that it was born. And so in a very reproving tone, he invites Israel to give him counsel then and command him concerning his work. And it's one of those moments that take us from a very small bubble and a very small circle of concerns, and they feel huge to us because there are problems, and our problems are our problems, and so we're upset about them, and we're frustrated, and we're stressed, and we have all this experience. So you feel like the world is coming to an end. I can remember numerous times growing up as a kid. I thought the world was coming to an end over this or over that little thing, and so us parents kind of smile amusedly at our young children when they think the whole world's going to end because they can't tie their shoe. But it takes us from that moment where we're feeling that pressure and zooms way out to the entire universe that God created. All of the parts of it that are operating in such a way that the universe is sustained and life is sustained and things function as they were designed to function. And so it really asks us, or should cause us to ask that question. Yes, I feel like I'm an authority on my life. I'm an expert in me, and I can speak very confidently about what I would like to see happen and not happen. But can we really order the universe or even just our small place in it? And so it's just one of those sort of moments like Job had by the end of the book of Job. Now, it's easy to sit in our comfortable chair and to pull our favorite blankie up on our laps and maybe have a little cup of tea or coffee or something like that. And from such a comfortable position, it's easy to read a passage like this, to look at Israel and just give them a tisk. But we really are the same when we question God's sovereignty, when we object to his predestination, when we strive against his providence in our circumstances, which are not what we would like them to be, when we emote against his election. Because when God doesn't do things the way that we would like, or he doesn't do them with the instruments perhaps that we would like, and you think about, Steve referenced in the Sunday school this morning when Joshua was jealous for Moses' sake because others were prophesying. And you think about those that came to John the Baptist and essentially were trying to invoke a jealousy between him and Jesus. Well, he's gaining more followers than you are. Sometimes it's easy to be upset. Maybe not that something is happening, but God's not using me, or maybe I'm not directly benefiting as much from what is happening, even though it's a good thing. So it's easy to identify individually with this. I mean, can anyone ever say that they've never been unhappy with the way that something has gone in life? Well, certainly not. So we come to chapter 46, and we're continuing. Isaiah is continuing to vindicate God against the idols. And this is sort of a contrast that gets set up. It is a very stark contrast between God and the idols that we get in this section. And really the absurdity of the idols is just put on full display. The idols couldn't save themselves. They couldn't save Babylon. They couldn't save the Assyrians. They can't save the nations. They can't save anyone. And so God's sovereign counsel, assuring that Cyrus will do his appointed task, and it turns out on, or it turns really on this stark contrast, because God said so, and God never fails to accomplish what he speaks. So in this chapter, again, 13 verses, and we'll just keep it all in a big chunk as we go through it. And really what we find here are essentially 4 declarations that speak to God's sovereignty, his superiority, and really that, again, is the ground of the hope and the assurance that Israel is to have, that even though these hard times are ahead of them, that God will not forsake them, and he will keep his promises just as he said. Let's start with verses 1 and 2. Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. Your carriages were heavy loaden. They are a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. So Bel and Nebo references to chief gods of Babylon, and they're known by various names. And they were large statues. As I understand at the time, there were very large statues of these gods. They were overlaid with gold. They were extremely heavy, and they were difficult to move around. And he's referring here to the Persian invasion of Babylon. Now, this is another case where Isaiah prophetically is speaking about something as though it's already happened, and this hasn't happened yet. It's over a century away before this will happen, but he's referring to it as though it has happened. So the Persian invasion of Babylon and their idols essentially were carried away captive. And this is a very common practice that nations would exert, because they believed, well, their idols, their gods are better than yours. So they would take those gods captive and so on. And they were it's pointing out that they were a very heavy burden for the beasts to bear and to carry. They're laid down on the backs of the animals. It's talked about there in verse 2. They're laid down on the backs of the animals for transport. And the idols could not even prevent their own captivity. So in other words, these idols, these were the gods that Babylon was trusting in. The gods that Babylon praised, because they'd had a lot of success. They had displaced Assyria. They had essentially taken that place as the world power at that time. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. So they'd accomplished a lot, and they praised these idols for all this accomplishment. They trusted these idols for their protection. And even the very idols themselves, these huge statues overlaid with gold, could not prevent the statues from being taken into captivity. Now, of course, this is also a rebuke to Israel because of their idolatry. They likewise would be carried away into Babylon. Now, verses 3 and 4. Hearken unto me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, which are born by me from the belly, which are carried from the womb. Even to your old age I am he, even to hoar hairs will I carry you. I have made and I will bear, even I will carry and will deliver you. Now, this is a study in stark contrasts. This is black and white. You just can't miss it. He starts talking about these idols and how they were a burden. They had to be carried around. They had to be borne from place to place. They were very hard. It was hard to move them. And for all of their worship and all of their esteem shown to them and all the praise to them, they could not prevent going into captivity. And so the point being that the idols have to be carried by those that make them and those that worship them and those that bow to them, those that serve them. They have to be carried by them. And God immediately starts now with this picture that's a very motherly picture, and describing essentially himself as a mother loving, nourishing, and carrying his child. So it flips that completely around. The God of Israel isn't carried around by the nation. The God of Israel isn't a heavy burden that's breaking the backs of the people of Israel. It's the other way around. The God of Israel carries his nation. Again, a very stark contrast. But even there, do you notice how that the metaphor just gets so far exceeded? Because what happens to those cute little babies? And I just absolutely love looking back and seeing little Silas back there and hearing those little noises. But what happens to them? They grow up. I mean, Steve's baby is almost 50 years old. They grow up. So really, a mother can only nurture and carry that baby for just so long. And they begin growing. And when they begin growing, the relationship begins to change. And as they continue growing, then, they get older and they get a little more independent, and it just keeps changing, and then into adulthood. But notice how that in this metaphor, he goes on in verse 4 to say, but even to old age. This is a fact that never changes. Even to old age, from the belly, from the womb, but even to gray head. He said, I carry you. I've made you. I will bear you. You will be my burden. I will carry you. I will deliver you. And so once again, God has shown and demonstrated once again how that he is the only God. Now we get to verses 5 to 11. To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we may be like? They lavish gold out of the bag and weigh silver in the balance and hire a goldsmith, and he maketh it a god. They fall down, yea, they worship. They bear him upon the shoulder. They carry him and set him in his place, and he standeth. From his place he shall not remove. Yea, one shall cry unto him, yet he cannot answer, nor save him out of his trouble. Remember this and show yourselves men. Bring it again to mind, O ye transgressors. We'll pause just there a second. We'll pick up the rest of the verses. But what God is like the Lord? In other words, the statues that the Babylonians worshiped, they had different names. They had different appearances than the statues that were worshiped by the Persians, the statues that were worshiped by some other nations. All their gods had different names. They had different attributes. They had different levels of strength. They may have looked different. But what God is like the Lord? You see, they had a lot of things in common, all of these statues. And that's that they were just that. They're just statues. They might be overlaid with gold. They might just simply be carvings of exotic wood. They might be chiseled out of stone. But they're just that. They may all have eyes, but there's not a one of them that can see anything. They have ears, but they can't hear anything. And they can't move unless they're carried around by someone else. So how are you going to compare the God of Israel to the gods of the nations? The point being, there's no comparison. And then we get another picture. This gets into the absurdity again here in verses 6 to 8, because he's giving us again that picture of these idols being made, the manufacture of these gods made out of silver and gold, and not only made out of silver and gold, but they you can think of it as they're very costly to make. They're very expensive to make. If you remember reading in the book of Acts what happened in Ephesus, when idol makers in Ephesus began to have their business, their profits affected because the preaching of the gospel by Paul and his companions and those that had been converted to Christ, that so many people had been saved in Ephesus that it actually was harming the idol manufacturing trade. And so they were upset about it because they're expensive. They're expensive to make. And idols being costly is also in terms of the absurdity. The makers of the idols, the worshipers of the idols, well, they have to carry them around. And he can't answer them. And really we're getting here just a direct rebuke by the time you get to verse 8. In their exile, they are to call to mind this prophecy. They are being called upon to remember this. And when they see these things in Babylon, they are to remember this. What would be the effect of that? Well, the effect of that would be, yes, we remember that God said this would be the case, that the idols of Babylon have been carried away. Israel would witness that. So the effect is God, Yahweh, He truly is God, the only God. And His word is true and right. Now we continue with this part, verses 9 to 11. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. Yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. They are to remember the former things. What are the former things? Well, this refers to those things that at this point were in their history. The Exodus from Egypt, for instance, the plagues, the judgments upon Egypt, the Red Sea crossing, God's miracles in the wilderness, and so on. They are to remember all of the prophecies that have gone before, that have been fulfilled, all the deliverances that God has performed for them, all the many times, in other words, that God has proven, has demonstrated that He is the only God. And so he ties this to the foretelling of His works and the doing of His works. So he's telling them to remember that, to call that to mind. And then he expresses in verse 10 this essentially, really the essence of godhood, what it is that separates God from all else. He declares the end from the beginning. In other words, we're told in language, familiar language in the King James, about those things that God had decreed from before the foundation of the world. So before the creation ever began, God determined, He declared these things. He declared the very end. In other words, God does as He wills to do. And in this context, we do have another reference to Cyrus, sort of representative. He comes from a far country. He executes the Lord's counsel. Babylon at that time essentially was the pinnacle of human achievement in terms of empires. And raising up of Cyrus would be a sign to Israel, would be a sign that God is God alone, that He's supremely sovereign and over His creation, so that His plans are carried out regardless of who opposes them, regardless of what instrument He chooses. And we sometimes wrestle with that. Steve was talking about that a little bit in the Sunday school again this morning, talking about folks like Balaam and Judas, and how it seems like that, they were instruments used at a time and even seemingly for good, but then what happens to them in the end. Well, remember the former things. God accomplishes His purpose, and He uses willing and unwilling. He uses whatever vessel He's pleased to use, whatever instrument that He is pleased to use. That's what He uses. And yeah, that bothered Israel, and it bothers us a lot of times the same way. Verses 12 and 13, hearken unto me, ye stout-hearted, that are far from righteousness. I bring near my righteousness, it shall not be far off, and my salvation shall not tarry. And I will place salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. Now, this word stout-hearted, essentially, it almost sounds good, but it basically means stubborn. Being far from righteousness certainly fills in the picture. It's describing them in their sins and in their rebellion. And it's almost ironic that those who are so far from righteousness would attempt to counsel the God who does everything in righteousness, which He has declared several times in this past couple of chapters. And then we have this contrast. God brings righteousness. God brings salvation. Obviously, this is, again, looking forward to Christ and His kingdom. I'll place my salvation in Zion, for Israel my glory. It's this restoration of Jerusalem, worship filling the earth, restoration of the nation to their promised inheritance. All of these things are evoked here. So we can see how these chapters are building up to those servant songs that we've talked about that we'll begin pretty soon. We're getting much closer to them. So when we think about this chapter, the nations carry their idols, their gods around, but God carries his nation, not the other way around. Now in Isaiah, we do have a rare view. And we talked about this when we were in the book of Exodus, because the book of Exodus, God's hand is so clearly seen, and attention is repeatedly drawn to it, and it's continually emphasized. It's almost as if you could take the book of Exodus and you just cannot miss it. It's pointed out repeatedly that God did this, God did that. And oftentimes we have God saying that he was going to do that, God doing it, and then God saying that he did it. Now, that may remind you of certain repetitious preachers, but I assure you that is not a product of divine revelation. That is probably just human limitations. God would say what he's going to do. He would do it, and then he would say that he did it repeatedly in Exodus. And what's the point? You just can't miss that this is God doing it. So this is being giving us sort of that rare view again, because a lot of times, and you can think about like the book of Ruth or the book of Esther, and you can see how that providence is moving along, and we don't get any references to God's hand doing this or that. And then we get that great speech from Mordecai where he essentially says, perhaps. He knows, based on prophecy that God's already revealed, he knows that deliverance is coming to the Jews. He knows they're not going to be destroyed. And he says to Esther, perhaps it's for this time that you have been put in this place, which the book does tell us several times, emphasizing that she was extremely and probably somewhat uniquely beautiful. She's put into this place in the palace where she does have access to the king, and she can actually do something for her people. But all that Mordecai can say is that perhaps you're in this place for this reason. But know this, deliverance is going to come. Whether you do this or not, deliverance is going to come. So those kind of books where it almost seems like that God is hidden. We don't see overt acts. We don't see supernatural intervention like we do in the book of Exodus. And we don't see even references like here where God is telling very plainly, these things are going to happen. It's over 100 years away, but it's going to happen. And when it happens, I want you to remember. I want you to remember. Assyria and Babylon and Persia all acted out of their own interests, but they fulfilled God's will because he directed their rise and their fall and all these events along the way. Now, Isaiah does continue to show God as the primary actor. In other words, he deliberately draws attention to this time and time again. How is it that Israel is going to be saved? Well, we've seen a few alternatives, haven't we? As we've come through the book of Isaiah, we've seen secret alliances with Assyria, with Egypt, and trusting in these other nations and forming coalitions that they might be able to withstand the enemy empire and so on. So there's been a lot of different ideas, trusting in idols and various things. But God's the primary actor. He will deliver Israel. He will bring the kingdom. So there's a contrast with the idols of the nations. The idols must be carried, but God carries his own. The idols cannot move, but God moves history. The idols cannot answer, but God declares the future. Idols cannot save, but God saves everlastingly to the ends of the earth. at no cost. So the promise to restore Israel seems impossible. And if we really want to sort of enter into what that must have felt like, even think about the laments that we have in the Psalms that were written by men of faith who were struggling so hard with this promise because Jerusalem was in ruins. The temple was destroyed. Lamentations, one of the most painful books in all of the Bible, as if they were just in a complete trauma. Like this just cannot be real. And these are people of faith that are struggling with this. So it's understandable why this promise seems so impossible, that Israel could be restored. But it's true. And after such a long exile judgment, even many believers in more modern times have rejected this hope. They have turned this promise into some sort of spiritualized fulfillment with some sort of mystical entity that they refer to as the church. But it never really makes sense how this is fulfilled that way. But Isaiah calls us back. If God has spoken it, he will do it. And he'll do what he spoke. He'll do what he said. He will bring it about because he purposed it, no matter how impossible that it may seem to us. So we have some of the most direct, strongest statements of God's sovereignty in the Bible are spoken here in reference to God restoring Israel from exile when he places salvation in Zion. So the message to Israel and the message to us even, you are not self-sustaining. You are not self-preserving. You are not self-delivering. So how does that feel? Disappointing? Scary? Suffocating? It's actually hopeful. It's actually sustaining. And it's actually strengthening. And really, it's what we truly need in dark and distressing and dangerous times. We're not self-preserving. We're not self-sustaining. We're not self-delivering. God is God, and we are not. And praise his holy name. We leave it all to him. All right, we'll stop here and we will close with a hymn.
We will conclude with My Need of Thee.